From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hi again. Welcome to the blazing hot summer edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis. Break out the shorts. This is not supposed to happen, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to point out that if you're a gardener, as I am, and you're seeing things in bloom and in bud that are not supposed to be in bud at this time of the year, there's reason for alarm. And we're going to be talking today about all sorts of things that there's reason for alarm for, because we've got a couple of very interesting people joining us today talking about, conspiracies, occupations, terrible things that are happening all around us. And I refer to George Schmidt, who I'm really glad to have back on the program again. George, thank you, from Substance News. And as you can tell from his new jacket, officially I guess you've been a member of the Chicago Teachers Union for a long time, but
true. But
now you're what?
Well, I'm a delegate at Chicago Teachers Union House of Delegates, and I work as a consultant at the union, doing some research now.
So it's an interesting position you're in as a journalist, being a journalist and an advocate for a union in your newspaper.
It's just a more forthright position what you get from those places that put out 50-page codes of ethics that everybody follows, as long as it promotes capitalism and stuff like that.
You're obviously not afraid to state your bias right out there. So
we just say we're an advocacy publication. We try to be we try to make the last reaction call and try to get a reaction quote, but we're not going to pretend that we're unbiased, because everybody else is, and they just have this little halo they put on.
Right. Well, we got a couple of interesting publications here today, because we have Joe Macare here from the Tribune, but it's the occupied Chicago Tribune, and also Truthout. Glad to have you back with us again, Joe. I know we've talked to you in the past about Occupy movement and all the things that are related to that. So we thought it'd be interesting to have a couple of these guys come in and just kind of like tell us what the threat alert level should be in Chicago right now. I think a good place to start, Joe, maybe we could start with you on this, is this, just in the last couple of days it's been breaking that the New York City is now attempting to subpoena Twitter records from people who were involved in Occupy Wall Street. It almost went completely unnoted back in December when the Boston Police Department, in a kind of ham-fisted way, tried to subpoena records from the Occupy Boston. It seems weird to me, because Twitter is such a public medium. I mean, it's like if you tweet something, it's there and it remains there. What is there to subpoena? But if you think a little more deeply about it, maybe what they're looking for is they want to have who these people are, what their real names are, and where they're, do you care about this? Is this something that you're concerned about?
I mean, I'm concerned about it as a reflection of a larger pattern of surveillance of not just Occupy in general, but peaceful activism, something that's going on kind of nationwide. I do think it's ham-fisted, as you say. I think it represents kind of a misunderstanding of how Twitter is used. Yeah. It's really mostly a platform that is public, as you say. And a lot of people within the Occupy movement and other activist movements are perfectly happy to put their real name, their government name on their Twitter profile. So it's not entirely clear what information police departments would be looking for.
But one of the things that, and I'm speaking from ignorance here, because I really don't understand this at all. I don't really understand what it is that the police are looking for. But in one particular case in New York, there was a situation where the police had told the occupiers that they couldn't cross the bridge, and someone tweeted, I'm getting this all wrong, but someone in effect said, "Oh no, we're going anyway." So the question is, did that person then violate the law because there was a police order not to do it, and by tweeting, "We're going to do it anyway," he put himself on the record as saying, not only am I about to break the law, but I advocate you break the law too. So we could be in a whole new world, a whole brave new world of there being these documents that are subpoenable that that could cause a lot of problems for people that they weren't really thinking about at the time.
Right, and in Britain, where I'm from originally, someone was just sentenced to jail time for something they wrote on Facebook, which was thought to be inciting people to break the law. So you are in the situation now where statements that people make on social media are being taken as evidence of some intent to break the law. I think the other interesting thing and problematic thing in terms of how movements like Occupy use social media, but also things like live streaming, is that there's now a fairly fierce debate about the fact that law enforcement are looking at those kind of public forms of communication. So there becomes this issue of how much information should you be giving out? When people, especially so-called citizen journalists, who in general have been pretty beneficial to the movement. There is, however, this issue of if you tweet possibly without thinking about who's going to be reading it, or if you have a live stream that the police could easily go and watch, are you putting information out there that is then going to lead to individuals being arrested? And so there are some issues of kind of transparency versus not wanting to do anything that actively leads people to get into more trouble.
All right, George, you're sitting there smirking. What's on you?
This is old as the first crucifixion. I mean, this is the chilling effect strategy of police everywhere. I mean, we get off kind of light in the United States most of the time. We're not suffering the same kind of activities that, say, in Syria that just came out. But basically, any police where there's this tendency to want to create a police state is going to try to send a message to people to suppress their willingness to express themselves. And so that's what I see in this. And I'm thinking back 44 years ago, the FBI showed up at my job after I participated in the Democratic Convention demonstrations, and it was the same stuff. So this isn't anything new. It's just maybe we have a shorter historical memory now that everybody can get everything in 40 characters, but it's old.
It would have been interesting to have seen what might have happened in the Chicago conspiracy trials with Judge Hoffman if everybody had a Twitter account and he had transcripts of things that they were tweeting while they were running around in Grant Park.
Well, that's precisely why the FBI came to my job back then, was they were circling the conspiracy indictments at that time, and just interviewing us. Don't worry, we're just here to find out, whether you were doing good stuff to end the war or bad. Right. And it was ridiculous, but that's the way it always works. It's as old as good cop, bad cop.
But not to beat a dead horse here, but we are talking about something new now. We're talking about the ability to create a record, a written record of your instantaneous thoughts about the situation that you're in at that moment that could be very haunting.
Well, maybe
6
people
months later.
shouldn't blurt their instantaneous thoughts out regularly.
Well, there you are.
Yeah, it is a double-edged sword, I think. But the interesting thing is that even before Occupy, there has been, and there were recently, it was actually on Gawker.com, there was a good story about this, about FBI surveillance of not just animal rights groups, but anyone who was sort of affiliate with that, down to the point where you have law enforcement looking at sort of organic farmers markets and all these very harmless things.
Right.
And that kind of criminalizing or treating as criminal activities that are completely within, by almost anyone's definition, within the scope of the law, is troublesome. And recently in Miami, you had the eviction with a SWAT team of a bunch of occupiers. What was new there was that they weren't being evicted from a building they had occupied. They were being evicted from legal residences on the claims that the police thought there might be arms there. But that's a new level of.
Well, I know you have concerns about this, but I think both of you would agree that Mayor Emanuel has said that we don't have these kind of problems in Chicago because there was an Occupy thing that happened back in October, and the Chicago police handled it very well, very professionally, and he's not worried about any of those things happening, any of those kind of problems happening when NATO arrives. So I'm sure you're here to reassure us that we're going to be okay in that realm.
Well, I'm just proud that Substance covered those 2 nights by the statues at the edge of Grant Park.
Taking the horse.
Well, I'm talking about especially the one where the nurses set up the first aid tent. I mean, that was police state tactics from beginning to end, and if Mayor Manuel is proud of it, I think that foreshadows what people should prepare for NATO.
Right, and it should be said that everything's relative. And what Emmanuel is saying is, we didn't have scenes in Oakland, scenes comparable to those in Oakland and New York. But the thing is, those scenes
pepper sprays.
Yeah, I mean, those things were extremely shocking. And because nothing like that has happened in Chicago, which, by the way, I'm not entirely sure that Rahm Emanuel is the one to take credit for it. I think it's a lot more complicated to that, and to do with the strategies of occupiers and to do with law and, the Chicago Police Department at a much more local level. But it's still 300 people arrested for trying to set up a camp in a public park.
And kept for a couple of days.
Yeah, exactly. Cases. Especially the second time around, where the treatment they received was
if they were
much
there was their second arrest.
Yeah, especially.
Well, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but I also was there that night and watching carefully, and I think that there was an interesting sort of theater going on between the police and the demonstrators. I mean, if you saw the way they set up that kind of almost like red carpet where they were marching the demonstrators out 2 by 2, each in the arms of their own police officer, and when they got down to the end where the cameras weren't really watching, they were all kind of joking with each other because they had done this before. It was almost like a big public display that was being put on. I don't think that's the same situation that we're going to be facing when we have lots and lots of people coming to Chicago to protest. It's going to be a very different thing. This is not the home crowd. It's not a home game kind of thing. So anyway, but I know we have lots to say about that, but we'll hold that for later on when it gets closer to. George, you covered the schools, I understand, the Chicago Public Schools. You've covered several issues that have been happening in recent times. There's a bunch of stuff, seriously, that I really would like to talk with you about today, because this has been the #1 topic around this table since we've been doing the show. And it just gets more and more confusing to me all the time. I think I'd like to start with just something that you wrote, because this may not be the top of the news, but it's indicative of some things. Talk to me about the regeneration of the discussion about merit pay for teachers. It seems to be cropping up again. There's a lot of discussion in Chicago that, the way to fix the problem is to pay teachers commensurate with their abilities to teach children.
Yeah, but merit pay's failed every time it's been used in things as important as public education, or in another form, in war. You can't use merit pay in certain forms. It doesn't work. Every time it's been tried and studied, it says it doesn't work. There's 2 problems with it. One is just the grossness of saying we're going to reward you for manipulating data about children in a public school where you're going to have to take everybody in. Immediately that sets a new standard where you're promoting the idea of, I'm going to get rid of the kid who's going to keep down my bonus. This isn't like manufacturing screws in a machine shop. This is an enormous, infinite variety of human beings. And once the merit pay formula is narrowed down to the only things they can come up with, like value-added matrices, which are all wrong and have failed everywhere too, then what you have is a built-in incentive not to really perform, but to play games with the data and play games with the actual inventories. This is old as capitalism, and it'll be around for as long as there's ideologues and theologians like Rahm Emanuel who have a structured belief that says this is the way to go. Specifically, though, what's happening in Chicago right now is the Board of Education has put on the table to the Chicago Teachers Union contract proposals that say in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th years of the 5-year contract they want everything's going to be based on merit pay. Now that's as ridiculous as possible. They've already done it because the principals are not unionized in the same way we are. They've done it to the principals, and it's grotesque with the principals because of the way the system is trifurcated. Therefore, all the motivations are bad, and they're not going to get better, and the research has all proved it over and over. But these people are literally theologians. They're not really scientists, and they're not dealing with something that's going to help the majority of children.
Now, this is tricky because you're a union guy. You're a union advocate. So there are 73 people watching right now who are yelling at their TVs. He's just a union slug. These guys at the union. This is what they don't want merit. They don't want to applaud excellence. They want to applaud a sort of a level of mediocrity where everybody gets paid the same for doing the same old thing. How can you respond to that visceral kind of personal argument?
I just say you're wrong.
Thank you.
You know, they're wrong. And if I have the time and somebody wants to buy a beer, maybe we can talk about it in the context of the real world. But the best way to have the conversation is begin to say, do you have children, more than one child in your own family?
Yeah, yeah.
And all you need is one child who's a little bit off the normal curve to see how you're going to have to provide specialized services for that child. Once merit pay becomes that sort of norm, that child's going to be pushed someplace else. That child's not going to be in the data set. Now, if these people don't have children, or they're as mindless as the Atlas Shrugged generation that was just bred to say this stuff over and over, well, I probably wouldn't bother talking to them, because it's not based on anything where we're going to win or lose a debate. It's based on sheer power. They've had the power for the past quarter century or so, thanks to Occupy and a lot of other stuff, including the unions all along. We're counteracting that power. But the debate was over a long time ago, except that these people just keep quoting Ayn Rand and believing what they want to believe no matter what we do.
Right, and I should say that the CPS and Mayoral and Brizard have set this up that they care about, the narrative that they've set up is that they care about children and the unions care about teachers, and that's the conflict. But that's an extremely dishonest way of framing it on their part, and it's led to things like Brizard claiming that at the CPS board hearing that nobody stood up and talked about the children when they were, advocating against closing and turning around schools. That's just a fabrication, and something like the occupation of the Piccolo Elementary School shows that there are people in the communities, parents and children and students, who don't want their schools closed down or turned around. So it's not just about the teachers, although teachers have been hugely vilified by the people who want to reform education.
The mayor does care about children because he's putting cameras in front of every school that will slow traffic down, because he doesn't want children harmed by traffic. So you can't just make a blanket statement that the mayor doesn't care about these things. Is there a situation ever in, we'll call it the labor environment, where it makes sense to differentially pay people for doing essentially the same job based on their ability to do the job? Can you give me a pure example of someplace where it might work? You use the screw factory. I don't think none of us have had experience with. They're all gone. They're all in China. I don't know if they have merit pay in China, but I mean, in a purely sort of manufacturing situation, let's say, where your job is to turn out widgets, and if you can turn out 65 widgets as opposed to 55 widgets, should you be paid more?
Well, it depends on how old you are and how many hours a day you're working. I mean, the classical question on that is to say, if somebody can turn out 50 widgets in 4 hours, how many can he turn out in 12 hours? And the answer isn't 4 times 3. The answer is, how tired is the person after 4 hours? It's as old as the John Henry story. I mean, you can work yourself to death if you're in this crazy race to the top that some people promote as a model for society, but it doesn't get any better just because it's repeated. And in some fundamental human activities, and probably in a lot more than I am familiar with, some fundamental human activities like the teaching of children or the making of peace, which supposedly we're into too in other places, you really have to set up a structure where there's an ethical basis that goes far beyond body counts and numerical controls. It's just ridiculous to pretend that you can do this in this other way, and we're seeing this tragically right now in Afghanistan, for example, and that's one of the things that's going to be right in front of the city when NATO gets here.
Right, and the debate about efficiency within the private sector is one thing, and we could talk about, you know, how it affects people employed by the private sector to have, you know, to constantly be seen as part of a machine, and how can we make them be more efficient? How does that affect workers in the private sector? But a lot of, you know, modern democratic societies have a mixed society where you have a private sector for some things, and then you have a public sector for things like education, healthcare, although not in this country, and you know, and certain other functions of government. And the push to turn all of those into privatized sectors, because supposedly, you know, business works so much more efficiently and the market knows what to do. I mean, that is an extremist and, you know, as George said, an ideologically driven push. It's not, you know, because the data doesn't support it. It's not some kind of sensible idea.
I get a little bit confused about this because, as I've mentioned on other shows, if the Commerce Department 15 years ago had issued a request for proposals for government agencies to develop a tablet computer about this big that had a really high resolution display and you could do all kinds of cool things with it and it could run your life, I don't think the government could have done that on its best day. But the private sector, with a couple of companies beating the hell out of each other and just, you know, just driven to get there, they did. They created it. So there is that. Well, I mean, come on. Now, you got to say that's a place where the private sector, you know, I know all the, the private, which company was able to do the fastest job of getting to China to build factories where 40,000 people would work for nothing and develop this wonderful product? Okay, I'll stop you before you get there.
The same kind of company that was based in Boston in 1820 and was profiting off the slave trade and the cotton trade in alliance with their friends in Manchester, England. I mean, that's what we're talking about here, but let's do a historical mic check on this one. Okay.
Mic check.
I'm reading a book called Turing's Cathedral, which is about the development of the first computer in the United States. And the people who came together to develop that computer and the components of that computer after World War II, and a lot of the funding for that computer.
Okay, they were government.
They were all
came out of the
government, and John Henry von Neumann was a government employee through most of the 1940s and 50s. This is not a discussion we're going to just have to limit it to Apple and the iPad.
You know, I'm throwing this out here because I have a real struggle with this because in that piece of the picture, there is this role for private enterprise. But what good would the iPad be to us today if there hadn't been ARPANET, if there hadn't been government expenditure on all of the infrastructure on which this private sector stuff is based? It was done because you and I kicked some money in and we said, hey, government, go out there and set standards, you know, and develop the protocol upon which these things can be based. And that's what happens because we have a common square. We believe in the commons, or at least we used to. I don't think we do anymore, but we used to.
The internet is basically the interstate highway system of you know, web commerce, but it was built just like the interstate highway system was, as you point out, ARPANET. It was built by the government at all of our expense, and now we've got to balance the exploitation of it.
Okay, you know, we can just go on like this forever. Let's try to bring this back to some of the real world stuff. I'm interested in what appears to me to be yet another lessening of the role of local school councils in the Chicago public school system. Now, I mean, from the day the local school councils were announced, the very people who created it were undercutting it and trying to reduce the role of local school councils, in my humble opinion. And it's been a sort of a yin and yang ever since. But now we have a new administration and we have new leadership, and I'm finding that I just found it really interesting that we're in the process of a local school council election. There are hardly any people running for it, and CPS hasn't really been doing very much to promote that people should even go out and do it. So is it just dying of its own lethargy?
No, it's being murdered, just like the schools that are being turned around have been murdered and sabotaged. The best example.
Boy, I'm throwing you some softball questions today, aren't I?
The best example is the contrast between what was called the New Schools Expo, which was held at Navy Pier at the end of January, and the promotion for that, and the run for your local school council. I mean, there was literally a blackout on news and information out of CPS about the local school councils. If you called Chicago Public Schools anytime in January 2012, while you were on hold, instead of getting Montavani, you got a repeated message about go to the New Schools Expo at Navy Pier at the end of the month. I got, because I'm a public school parent, I have 2 kids in public schools, I got a robo-call from Israel Idonijay of the Chicago Bears saying, go to the New Schools Expo, wah, wah, wah. And it was courtesy of the Board of Education, obviously fed in that
And let me guess, you didn't get a robocall inviting you to go run for local school council.
And covering that as a story, I called the Bears and asked him, because Idonijay is a really great guy. He does a lot of charity work for kids, and you got to hand it to him. He was, if not misled into supporting that monstrosity in the New Schools Expo, he certainly lent his name to something that I think he needed a context for. So the result was all the promotionals and propaganda at public expense went into this charter school thing that took place in January. Now we have the actual mass democratic expression in the local school council elections in April that should be getting support for the 400 or so real public schools left in Chicago that have local school councils, and it's sabotage. The only thing I can describe it as is sabotage, and it's the script of the Brizard and Emanuel administration.
Do either of you believe at this point that local school councils are or can be effective and have a role, or have we gone beyond the point where they can really affect any kind of important change in the system?
Within the current system, I mean, as George says, the power is so kind of centralized at the top. It's hard to imagine that.
I'm sorry, I just saw that we just got the 2-minute warning. That's not possible. No, there's been a problem in the control room. I'm sure the clocks, maybe they didn't turn the clocks back or something. Are you kidding me? 2 minutes? What should we talk about? I'm completely flummoxed here. This has never happened before.
How about Rahm getting into the Hall of Fame and being Rookie of the Year at the same time?
Okay.
I mean, this Atlantic thing, I mean, almost every major magazine on Earth, and latest in the
He had a
April
list
issue
of things we
Atlantic
wanted to talk about to you.
Almost every major magazine on Earth has now done this is the best mayor in history for any major city in the world about Rahm Emanuel, and he's only in his rookie year.
Right.
I don't think they're saying in the world, they're just saying in the history of the United States.
Okay, I'm sorry, I exaggerate, but
that's your problem, George. You're always exaggerating.
But the baseball equivalent would be if the Baseball Writers Association elected some guy during his rookie year to the Hall of Fame, and so we don't have to do anything more. We'll just listen to his promises and his early stats.
Or gave
that's
a new
what we have.
president
It's so
the
ridiculous.
Nobel Peace Prize or something like
well,
that.
Okay.
And Jonathan Alter, who wrote the article for The Atlantic, leaves out a lot of things. He leaves out how, for example, the major donor to Emmanuel, Ken Griffin, who the Tribune interviewed recently, is also a huge supporter of the Cato Institute, the Koch brothers, and really sees all of that as being on the same page. And this idea that Rahm is kind of the sensible centrist Democrat, I think if you buy that, then I have a free newspaper to sell you.
Oh, this one, Occupied Chicago Tribune. Guys, I've never seen it happen like this before. We just completely lost control of the show, and we have to go. They're giving me the wrap-up sign. George Schmidt, thank you very much. I understand you're with the Chicago Teachers Union, and you're also, of course, with Substance News, and thank you very much for being with us today. Joe Macare is with us from Occupied Chicago Tribune and also from Truthout, and glad to have you back, and both of you glad to have you back, and we'll get you back here again sometime soon, just to tell the truth, You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You can find us right here on cable, but you can also see us online at this address, the one that is right below, right down there. Read that address and go there. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you for joining us and reminding you can also catch us on iTunes. Check out the podcast, too. We'll see you next week with another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on CAN TV. Till next time, take it easy.